Well, good morning to all of you. Good to see you here. And it's an honor to be here, and always an honor to be invited. My mama told me years ago you can get invited anywhere once, but if you get invited back, that's kind of an honor. So I'm honored to be here. This is an interesting lectureship and an interesting topic that I was assigned. Unbelievers, skeptics have always attacked the Bible, and they've attacked it in a number of ways. Clearly, obviously, they just don't want to go by the things that are written. They don't want to hear from God. They don't want any kind of limitations put on their behavior or anything like that. That's the real driving force behind that. But they try in a number of different ways to avoid responsibility for listening to God. God knew that we would always need to know whether a revelation came from Him or were just the product of someone's mind or fevered imagination. He gave several tests for false prophets in the Old Testament. I listed a couple of scriptures where you can go and take a look at those. Essentially, if a prophet makes a prediction that doesn't come true, he is not a prophet of God. If he makes a prediction that does come true and then advocates the worship of other gods, he's not a prophet of God. You don't need to pay attention to him. Jeremiah is very explicit when he says, if they live corrupt lives, you don't need to listen to them. They're not from God. And there are good reasons for looking at the words that are presented to us to see whether they really are from God or not. Skeptics don't want to hear what's in the scriptures. They don't want any kind of binding that's placed on them. About 1 million years ago, or maybe 20, Connie's, my wife's younger sister, was dating a guy briefly who was a petroleum engineering student at OU. And he was working on his master's degree, and I can still remember him sitting across the table at lunch one day. He was explaining to me what his graduate study was about, and his big emphasis was on rock mechanics. And I wanted to know, what does that mean? And he gave me a fairly good explanation about geology and how petroleum engineering would work in that regard. And if you know me at all, I'm a curious sort, however you want to explain that. I ask a lot of questions. So I kept asking him questions, and he gave me answers, and I was very interested in what he had to say. We finally wound down and looked at me, and he said, "And what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a minister." And he said, Oh, I understand. Oh, yeah. Well, I think the Bible is a great book for us to go by in our lives. Of course, we know that it's riddled with contradictions. And I just kind of smiled and looked at him and I said, "That's interesting. Tell me about one." And he blinked at me for a little while and finally said, "Well, I've heard that there are contradictions." And I said, "Yeah, you've heard wrong." And that was as far as he wanted to go. Didn't want to hear anything more that I had to say about the Bible or anything else. There are frequently these attempts to tell us that there are contradictions or paradoxes within the scriptures. And usually at the holiday seasons, Christmas and Easter, you will see the major news magazines or the major TV networks will have some kind of a show on talking about the lost books of the Bible or the hidden scriptures or the contradictions or the problems within the scriptures. And it's all about challenging faith and trying to make people doubt what they have been told, what they've believed. We get a lot of benevolence calls. People come in looking for help in the church building. Had a lady come in not long ago, needed some clothing, some work clothing. We have a clothing closet. So the lady who's in charge of that came in and helped her with that, was helping her get her finds out of the church building. And we started talking. I'm inviting her to come to worship with us, come to Bible class, and she decided to educate me. She was going to tell me that she was a Gnostic and not a Christian. I said, really, that's fascinating to me because, see, my master's degree is in early church history, and that stuff, honestly, it's right down the center of my interest. So I was just fascinated that she would say that. And I said, well, tell me more. What do you know? And she started explaining to me about the corruption of the Emperor Justinian and the Empress Theodora, and she's talking to me about the problems with the Council of Nicaea in 325. If you're not aware of it, there's about 250 years between those two, between Justinian and Nicaea. Anyway, I kept telling her, no, that's not right. What you think you're telling me is not right. We've never seen her since. She has no interest in knowing about God or knowing what the Scriptures say. She's just very intent on avoiding the plain meaning of the Scriptures. Many of the people who talk about contradictions within the Scriptures just want to avoid the plain meaning. That's the problem. And as Mark Twain said, it's not the things in the Bible that I understand or I don't understand that bother me. It's the things that I understand all too well that bother me. And people don't want to understand what's in the Scriptures. I love the quote by C.S. Lewis. If you have the book and are looking at the paper at all, C.S. Lewis said, what you must understand is the Bible is a grown-up book. And that means you're going to have to think once in a while. It's a grown-up book. It's for grown. You don't have the pop-ups and the little squeaky sounds in the book, and it's not, made out of cloth so you can chew on it. This is a grown-up book, and you're going to have to think about it from time to time. It's very important, I think, for us to recognize off from the very beginning what is a contradiction. It is an impossibility. A contradiction where one person says one thing as fact and someone else or the same person later on says something absolutely contradictory to it, offering it as fact. These two cannot be harmonized in any way. To say that there are difficulties in the Bible is not to say that there are contradictions. There are difficulties in the Bible, but to say, I don't understand this, is certainly not the same thing as saying no one can understand it. Do you hear the arrogance there? For me to say, I don't understand this, therefore no one in the entire world at any time can understand this. I'd have to be the smartest guy who ever lived. And Connie will tell you that's not true. Okay, 1950, George DeHoff published a book called Alleged Bible Contradictions Explained, and one reviewer said about that book that it was the first full-length treatment of the concept of contradictions that might obtain within the Bible since 1875, when John Haley wrote a kind of magisterial work that caught a lot of people's attention at that time. There have been many works produced since that have to do with the contradictions that are alleged within the Bible, but DeHoff points out, and I think very, very cogently, very accurately points out, most of the things that are offered as contradictions are simply shortcomings in the reader. There's something wrong with my understanding. If I come to a passage and see and believe that there's a contradiction here somewhere, in most cases, by far the vast majority of cases, the problem is right here with me. I have done something wrong there. And so he has listed several, and I repeated some of these, not by any means all of them. He had 11 or 12 different ideas that are problems that individuals have as they approach the Scriptures, but I think these will account for the great majority of the things that are offered to us as contradictions. When people talk to us and presume to shock us with these contradictions as if no one has ever seen any of this. By the way, let me just point out to you that very, very early on in Christianity, the pagan critics of Christianity pointed to these same passages and these same ideas. This is nothing new. Some of these have been alleged for well over 1,700 years. So they've all been answered repeatedly, answered successfully, and they still keep bringing them up. I don't know why. Very often, People just simply misinterpret the Scriptures. It is fairly easy to do. The Bible is a collection. It's a library of books, not one book. It's a library of books, 66 books written over about 1,400 years by about 40 different authors in 3 different languages, all of them ancient and difficult by our standards. Just the concept of translation and working within those biblical languages is fraught with all kinds of peril, and to understand the figures of speech in another language and in another time are always difficult. We had some missionaries from Nicaragua came and stayed with us a couple of years ago. They speak no English. My Spanish is really bad. It's getting better, but it was really bad then. And I was trying to explain to him a sensitive situation, and I used the expression, it's a ticklish situation. And I used the word for ticklish in Spanish, which is cosquilludo. I said, it's una situación cosquilludo. And he had the most blank look on his face and said, it's what? And I said, it's a ticklish situation. He said, I don't understand. I said, you don't have this expression in Spanish? He said, not where I'm from. And I said, it's sensitive. He says, oh, okay. Well, yeah, I guess I can kind of understand. Well, we do that. We have figures of speech, and we have what are called colloquial expressions that show up in various languages. They don't necessarily translate very well. And that's a problem for interpretation of Scriptures. We need to draw out the correct meaning of the Scriptures. People will often turn to a passage like Proverbs 26, verse 4. It says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. And then the very next verse, verse 5, says, answer a fool according to his folly. Well, which is it? What do you do with that? The answer is it depends on the fool. Honestly, it does. Sometimes you need to shut them up, and other times just let them go because everybody is going to see what you've got there. But you need to understand what a proverb is. A proverb is a short saying of general truth that requires some wisdom to apply properly. Well, it depends on the fool. So one of the proverbs will apply in virtually any condition. Different authors may express some things in different ways. One of the general rules of Bible study, and I reprinted that at the end of the offering that I did within the book, there's seven general rules of Bible study that are very, very good and are going to guide us into the proper meaning of the passage over 90% of the time with ease. But one of those rules is to understand who it is who is speaking. Who's doing the talking when we hear this? In John chapter 1 and verse 21, for example, the Pharisees came and demanded to know if John the Baptist were Elijah. And he said, no, not Elijah. He knew very well that his parents' names were Zechariah and Elizabeth, all right? He's not Elijah. His name's John. He knows who he is and what he's about. In Matthew chapter 11, though, Jesus flatly declared that if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Now, which is right? Is John correct or is Jesus right? Is it possible for John to be mistaken or Jesus to be mistaken? And the answer is they were both telling the truth. They're both saying exactly what is accurate. Different speakers, different authors may explain some things in different ways. John the Baptist knew very well who his parents were and where he was from. And Jesus also knew very well that John fulfilled every aspect of the work of the coming Elijah. He was exactly who was the messenger who was to be sent in Malachi chapter 3. He knew that exactly. Both of them are telling the truth. They're expressing the same thing in different ways. They're expressing things in different ways. Different dates sometimes result in different statements. At the very beginning of creation, God surveys everything that he's done at the end of the book of Genesis and declares it at the end of chapter 1, he declares it very good. It's very good. Everything that he's created is very good. It's exactly the way he wanted it. Just a couple of chapters later, by the time you get into chapter 6, as David just pointed out to us, it was desperately corrupt. And it's to the point that God is grieved that he even created humanity. I can't even imagine how bad the situation would have to be for God to be sorry he ever did it. But that's exactly the way it's expressed. Deep, deep disappointment. Well, how can that be? Chapter 1, it's all very good. Chapter 6, I'm sorry I ever did it. What happened between? Chapter 3, you got the whole Garden of Eden thing. And then you've got chapter 4 with the increase of homicide on the earth, and the degeneracy of humanity just continued and continued and continued and continued. It was bad. It was bad. Of course it was. Israel is commanded to observe the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 31. And forever, even the death penalty for those who refuse to observe the Sabbath. But in the New Covenant, the Sabbath is no longer a covenant feature at all. What's happened? Is it forever or is it not forever? The answer is, it is in God's covenant. And the New Covenant has changed everything. And consequently, the covenant terms have changed. Different dates, different times, result in different statements. Even different subjects in the author's minds will sometimes call for different expressions. Famously, if you have looked at Reformation history, Martin Luther was captivated by the idea of salvation by grace through faith, and especially the idea of faith being sufficient. And if you know what a crazy background Martin Luther had in his personal life, you can understand why he was so captivated by that idea. You just cannot work your way to heaven. So he's just thrilled with the idea of salvation by faith. It's all grace, it's all faith, everything's wonderful. And then you come to James, and so he was absolutely thrilled with everything that Paul said in Romans about faith and how important faith is. Then you come to James, and James is talking about a robust faith, a faith that works. And Martin Luther hated that book. He even thought that it didn't belong in the Bible. He'd like to just take that out. He called it an epistle of straw. It's just empty. It's just worthless. We need to get rid of that. Because of the emphasis on a faith that issues in works. Is there contradiction between Paul and James? The answer is, of course, there's no contradiction between them. What's fascinating to me is people talk about the contradiction between Paul in Romans and James in James, and they don't realize that both authors pointed to the very same scripture as proof positive of what they were saying. Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so Paul makes this wonderful argument about the necessity of a deep and abiding faith within us that leads to salvation. And James makes a wonderful muscular argument for a faith that issues in works. And they're both exactly right. They are both exactly right. It's just a matter of different subjects calling for different expressions. Probably will help us with the understanding of the different genealogies for Jesus that appear in Matthew and Luke. Luke's emphasis in Luke chapter 3, and you've probably all run into this, you've probably all seen the stark differences in the genealogy of Jesus between Matthew and Luke, and you may have been challenged on that subject. Well, Luke's emphasis in Luke chapter 3 is to demonstrate that Jesus is a direct descendant of God himself, stretching all the way back to Adam himself, who is the Son of God. Matthew's emphasis is different. His emphasis is to show that Jesus is the lawful heir of Abraham and of David. And so in order to accomplish that, he offers a symmetrical and memorable list of names in the genealogy. You have 14 generations between Abraham and David, 14 generations between David and Jesus. And in order to accomplish that, he has to manipulate the genealogy to leave some people out and count some twice. But his purpose is not to provide a pedigree. His purpose is to demonstrate that Jesus is the fulfillment of the covenant with Abraham through the covenant with David. That's his whole idea there. Different subjects require different handling of that. There are different methods of arrangement sometimes that seem contradictory. I was challenged with this very early in my work as a preacher. What about this letter that pops up in Ezra chapter 4 that is clearly out of place? Chronologically, that just cannot be defended. You have a letter that's addressed to Artaxerxes. He's not going to be king of Persia for another 60 years, long after Zerubbabel's death. Ezra 5 then has correspondence with Darius, who is before Artaxerxes. How can these be reconciled at all? And you realize the arrangement has nothing to do with the years, has nothing to do with the chronology. It has to do with the subject matter. These letters are placed where they are to demonstrate that the opposition to God's people, the false charges that were leveled against them, had always been there. And that was just a continual feature of the enemies of God's people. So you can't call that a contradiction. I suppose you could get one of those critics that just cannot be pleased. They just will not hear it, and they'd hold on to that as a contradiction, but it's not realistic at all, not fair. And another example has to do with the temptations of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 4 and in Luke chapter 4, we have two different accounts of Jesus being tempted by the devil. The order of temptations in Matthew is stones to bread, jump from the pinnacle, and all kingdoms if you worship me, Satan says. Well, in Luke 4, the order is stones to bread, and then it's all kingdoms, and then finally it's if you jump from the pinnacle, everyone will have to believe in you. How do you harmonize those two? What's the order? Is it Matthew's order or is it Luke's order? And a short and easy answer on that is Luke did not intend for this. He just intended to give all three of them. Matthew uses the adverb then. There's this, then there's this, then there's this. Luke doesn't use that adverb. He uses the word and. So he did this, and he did this, and he did this. And so there's no chronological contradiction there whatsoever. Just different arrangements of the same information. Different methods of computation can present us with different declarations. There are a lot of differences in the accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus, and particularly when you start talking about the hours that are involved. Mark 15:25 shows that Jesus is crucified about the third hour. John has Jesus in front of Pilate at the 6th hour. Now, how can this be? If he's crucified about the third hour, how can he be in front of Pilate at the 6th hour? On the one hand, it seems fairly insignificant to us, but there are people who just cling to something like that to demonstrate that this is all fiction, it never happened, no such thing. Some people have talked about different time standards. John is going by Roman time, where Mark is going by Jewish time. There's no doubt that there were differences of thinking in those cultural problems. You've got Roman law overlaying Jewish customs, and there were a lot of, points of dissimilarity there. Nevertheless, I don't think it's that difficult. Our problem is that in 21st century America, we're clock driven. And we are very, very careful about our time. And many of you right now are saying, how long, O Lord, will this go on? We're clock driven. We want to know how much time we have and so on. It's not true in the ancient world. And actually, when you get out of the developed world into third world countries, they are very much more relaxed about time, which makes us crazy when we go down and, trying to do things in Asia or Latin America where they're just not as clock driven as we are. Well, in the ancient world, they weren't as clock driven as we are. And they just had a general distribution of the day. You've got morning, third hour, mid-morning, 6th hour, around noon, 9th hour, mid-afternoon, evening. That's it. You just divide the day up. If you wanted to get a little bit more technical, you could talk about watches in the night, which would generally be 3 or 4 hours, depending on who you're talking to and which custom you're going to go by. In this case, what we probably have is Mark just being general about this time. One of the literary features of the Gospel of Mark is fascinating on all kinds of levels. Literary artistry in the Gospel of Mark is just staggering sometimes. One of the things that Mark does for us is he develops a sense of urgency in us. Early on in Jesus' career, it's very vague. One day, another time. One day they're by the lake. And there's just almost nothing to give us a time marker. As we get closer to Jesus' crucifixion, Mark hems us in time. So he starts talking about, it was the first day of the feast. It was the second day, very early in the morning of the fourth day. You get these time markers. Then he begins to narrow it down for us even more as we get into the last day and night of Jesus' life before his crucifixion, and then into that trial period on that Friday. So, and the reason Mark does that for us is to draw our attention and focus us ever more sharply on this event that is taking place in the crucifixion of Jesus. So, when he does that for us, he is squeezing us a bit. And so Mark becomes more precise about his time, and very likely, as Mark is talking about this, he just records Jesus' crucifixion about the third hour, which literally, honestly, could be anywhere between like 9:30 by our time to about 11:30. Just sometime mid-morning. John uses very much the same kind of thinking as he talks about sixth hour with Jesus. So, if Jesus appears before Pilate mid-morning and is almost immediately crucified, as almost certainly happens. It'd be a very short time lag there, 45 minutes, probably no more than 45 minutes or an hour between the pronouncement of sentence and the actual execution. Both of them are perfectly accurate. They've just looked at time, where Mark is seeing this in this much more constricted fashion. We're going really, really rapidly here. And he sees it more like third hour. It's mid-morning that this is taking place, where John is saying, it's around the middle of the day. Both of them are perfectly accurate. There's just no discrepancy there. Only in our minds, as we watch that clock, would we claim this is a contradiction. Sometimes misunderstandings of history and archaeology lead to charges of error. In almost all cases, those things are swept away when further archaeological historical finds are made. A famous one has to do with the name of Sargon in Isaiah chapter 20. People claimed that was impossible. Isaiah could not possibly have known what he was talking about. They knew. They had a whole list of Assyrian kings. The only Sargon on the list was 1,200 years before the time that Isaiah purports to relate. And then in 1849, this French legate and amateur archaeologist, Emile Boto, went out, dug into a huge hillside, discovered that it was all one palace complex that belonged to, guess who? Sargon. From this time, now he's called Sargon II to distinguish him from the earlier Sargon. But Isaiah was exactly right, and this has happened over and over and over and over again. A very famous case happened with the use of the term politarch in Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17 in verses 6 and verse 8. Luke uses this term politarch. And some classical historians pointed to that and laughed and said it's clear that Luke didn't write this, or he didn't know what he was talking about. This is just false. That's one of many passages that have led some scholars to conclude that the book of Acts is really a second century construct, not written by Luke at all, but by a student of his, or even a second or third generation writer. But the reality is that further exploration, further study, and the documents were there. The documents were already in the libraries. There's just so much to digest. Turns out that Luke was exactly right. The term politarch came into use and disuse, use and disuse, use and disuse over the centuries. And during the time related that Paul would have been in Thessalonica, it was precisely the term that would have been used for that particular official. And if you have any interest in this at all, you can go to a library and find Adrian Sherwin-White's magisterial work. It's not very long, but it is absolutely precise. It's called Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. It's out of print, but you can probably get it in the library. Sometimes problems of language lead to charges of contradiction. Translation is incredibly challenging. I'm not deeply schooled in biblical languages. I have a little bit of training. And over and over and over, when I dig into the original languages, I step back and look at the translation, and I just think these guys are really good. I mean, they know what they're doing. Translation is really, there are all kinds of possibilities for problems there. Years and years ago, I was thinking about getting into ministry, and there was an associate minister at Dell City named John Roberts. John was a very interesting guy and very, very well educated. And I started talking to him. We were talking about the Greek language, and he said to me, "You can always tell the preacher who has 1 year of Greek." And I said, "How can you tell?" He says, "Because he'll stand up in the pulpit and say, 'The Greek says.'" He says, "I have 5.5 years of advanced study of Greek, and the more I study it, the less sure I am that I know exactly what the Greek says." So after that, I was always really hesitant to ever say, "The Greek says," because I just knew there's somebody sitting there going, "Yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about, does he?" Translation is difficult, and the translators are really, really good at what they do. One example has to do with the meaning of the word Beersheba. In Genesis 21, it's called the well of the vow, or the well of the oath. In Genesis 26, it's the well of seven in Genesis 21. In Genesis 26, it's called the well of the oath. Which is it? The well of seven, or the well of the oath, or the well of the vow? Which is it? The answer is probably, Hebrew doesn't have vowels. They had to invent vowel points so that little children could know how to pronounce the words. So the consonants would just be an S-H sound and a V sound and a silent consonant after that. And what does that sound like? I don't know, but sometimes one very tiny change can mean a change in the word. Both of them are perfectly accurate translations. There's no problem at all understanding what Beersheba means. We talk about the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus said he'd be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. I actually saw a newspaper article that was written about this 15 or so years ago, a little more, but this was in a national publication put out on a weekend edition of the newspaper. And the guy's arguing about, Jesus said he'd be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, but you can't cram 72 hours into the time period between his death on Friday afternoon and his resurrection early Sunday morning. And he went on to say, this is not a quibble. He's thinking it's an impossible contradiction. His problem is he doesn't understand figures of speech. It's the big technical term is synecdoche. It just means a part for the whole, or the whole for the part. We do this all the time, and we never think about the figures of speech that we use. I have an example here. If I invite you to my house for supper, and you say, "What time am I supposed to be there?" And I say, "Well, you make sure your shoes are under my table at 7 p.m. Is that all I want, your shoes? Does that satisfy the invitation if your shoes? Of course not. I want you there at the table. You clearly understand that. Somebody buys a new car and they say, "Man, I got some new wheels." Is that right? You got wheels. That's great. Didn't you get the rest of the car? You need the whole thing. Well, of course, we understand how that works. It goes over and over and over. Jesus is drawing a clear contrast between himself and Jonah. The most common source of allegations of contradiction simply occur from intentional misrepresentations of the Scriptures. I list a few people here: Barbara Thiering, John Spong, John Dominic Crossan, and Bart Ehrman from the United States. They just want to find trouble, and they are dishonest at root. They are dishonest in the way they're handling the Scriptures and dishonest about what they're saying. So what do you do when you run across something that looks like a contradiction? What do you do with that? How can you handle that? If you do any Bible reading at all, you will from time to time run across something that disturbs you. You're going to remember a passage. As you're reading one passage, you'll come across something else, or you'll think you remember a passage and maybe remember it a little bit wrong. When there's a significant variation between what we expected and what we read, how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing that I would say is relax, take a deep breath, and the first thing you want to do is a careful reading. Just read it carefully. Very often, our eyes skip words. We can even skip lines. We can read into things we expected to find there when it's not actually there at all. You just need to do a slow and kind of careful reading of the Scripture. For example, you talk about the two thieves that are crucified with Jesus. In Matthew, we're told that they both reviled Jesus from the cross. In Luke, on the other hand, in Luke 23, we read that one of them reviled him and the other one pleaded for forgiveness and even argued with his colleague. Which is it? And the answer is yes. There's no contradiction there. If you just read it slowly and think about this, it's entirely likely that at first, in all of their pain and shock, they hear these insults and taunts being thrown at Jesus. Both of them would kind of join in because misery loves company, and it's possible that both of them began by reviling Jesus. But after a time, one of them is touched by the way Jesus is accepting his death and pleads for forgiveness. There's no contradiction. Both of those can be perfectly and easily harmonized. Sometimes you'll find a link between two accounts that seem to conflict. Mark chapter 2 talks about Jesus talking about in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, when David went into the tabernacle and took the bread. There are very slight differences of reading in other translations, but they all come down in the same place, but saying it's while Abiathar is the high priest. And you can look at the prepositional phrase in the original language and you're not going to get a lot of help there, frankly. It can be legitimately translated in both ways. And neither of them is going to give us any relief because it's not Abiathar we're looking for, it's his father. It all happened during the actual high priesthood of Abiathar's father, Ahimelech. But how do you harmonize it? Was Jesus wrong? Did he make a mistake? And there are people who will frankly say, yeah, he forgot what he was talking about, or he didn't understand it, hadn't read the Bible carefully. No. There weren't any chapter and verse divisions then. They just talked about chunks of the Bible with a well-known name or a well-known story that would take you to the general section of Scripture where you could find this information. Jesus is talking to his critics and talks to the Sadducees and says, have you not read in the account where Moses is at the bush? Where is that? Well, it's in Exodus. What chapter? They didn't have chapters. They didn't have chapters and verses. That's just the chunk of Exodus where you're going to find this. So that's how Jesus is talking about this. Of course, the people are going to be able to go back to the very area where Abiathar is the high priest, who was mentioned a lot more than his father Ahimelech. And that's where they're going to find this information. So just all you have to do, careful reading, careful study, think carefully about what's happening there. Sometimes just common sense thinking will help us. And we talk about the death of Judas and the kind of gruesome details that are listed about his death. Speaking of gruesome details, what time do you want me to quit? You want me to quit at 2 p.m.? I got 2 minutes. I'm not taking direction from you anymore. Let's go fast then, shall we? Sometimes the last thing that I would say about this, okay, first of all, deep, careful reading. Just go slow, read it carefully, study it carefully. Look at it very simply and just study it carefully to see if these things can be harmonized. Just common sense thinking can help. Sometimes deep research may be necessary for us to resolve some of the difficulties. Virtually everything that I've talked about here has been resolved as a result of deep research. Through history and archaeology and other disciplines that have been brought to bear on it, linguistics, these things have been resolved through deep research. We are generally not competent to do the kind of deep research that I'm talking about. We rely on experts. That's an entirely different problem. All I'm trying to say is don't panic. If it looks like a deep difficulty to you, don't let that disturb your faith. Pursue it, study it. It very likely is an explanation, and very likely has already been provided an explanation. So, the Bible has been attacked over and over and over and withstood all the attacks. I'd like for you, if you've never seen the 7 general rules for Bible study that I included at the end of this section, by all means, take a look at that. You're going to be guided into the accurate meaning of the Scriptures about 95+% of the time, simply by going across these seven rules. If you find something that doesn't work through these 7 rules, some deeper study may be necessary. And feel free, if you ever come into a problem that absolutely seems to stymie you and you just can't get anywhere with it, by all means, call Marion Fox or David Brassfield. They'll be delighted to help you. I gave you a list of some books that may be helpful. There are many, many, many other good quality research books to help you talk about the possibility of contradictions that are listed within the Scriptures. These things have been answered again and again and again, and we just continue to have the same questions brought up again and again and again. But here's the one thing you can be absolutely sure of. The Holy Bible is the inspired Word of God. It does not contain contradictions or discrepancies. They are not there. God has revealed Himself to us. The whole book is a story about God. It's a story about God interacting with humans that He has loved and provided redemption for. You can have absolute confidence in the pages of the Holy Scriptures. Thanks for your time.